In a secured office within the Admiralty, a naval intelligence officer stares at a series of decoded signals, his breath catching as the unthinkable reality of the Pacific War begins to shift right before his eyes. Winston Churchill and General Brooke already knew the stakes were astronomical, but as the reports from Midway Island filtered through Allied channels, suggesting the total destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet, the very foundation of global strategy trembled. The atmosphere within the British High Command during those first hours of June 1942 was not one of boisterous celebration or unbridled joy, but rather a chillingly quiet period of careful verification and controlled attention, because the senior leadership understood with a haunting clarity that early reports in wartime were often dangerously optimistic or outright fabrications. Memories of the 1941 disaster surrounding the German battleship Bismarck remained fresh and sharp, serving as a constant reminder of how premature confidence could lead to a catastrophic unraveling. Just as the sudden and humiliating collapse of British power in Malaya and the fall of Singapore had proven that reassuring assumptions were the most lethal enemies of a commander. As these intelligence summaries moved upward through the intricate naval and political channels of London, the tone remained clinical and restrained, offering no carrier names for confirmation and providing no certain casualty figures, because the outcome, while promising a glimmer of hope, was not yet fixed in the official cold language of the Admiralty. At the very center of Britain's wartime government, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was briefed as the information accumulated, his mind already spinning with the broader implications for a Pacific theater he had been forced to deprioritize under the Allied Germany First strategy. Churchill had approved that strategy with a heavy, reluctant heart, fully aware that by focusing on the European theater, the precious British possessions in Asia would remain exposed and vulnerable to the relentless Japanese advance that had already stripped the Empire of Hong Kong and much of its Far Eastern prestige. What the reports from Midway suggested was not necessarily the immediate restoration of British power in the East, but rather the first credible halt to Japanese momentum, a strategic breathing space that Churchill greeted with a discipline born of years of political and military turmoil. Instead of instructing the public to celebrate or issuing the kind of dramatic statements that had defined his career, he leaned over the maps and asked what had been verified, what remained a mystery, and exactly what the loss of Japanese carriers would mean for the delicate strategic balance of a world at war. Britain in mid-1942 was a nation under immense strain, bleeding from U-boat attacks in the Atlantic, locked in a brutal struggle in North Africa, and bracing for a renewed German hammer blow in Europe, meaning that no single battle, no matter how spectacular, could be allowed to distort the grim reality of their global position. Alongside the Prime Minister, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Brooke, approached the news with characteristic reserve that bordered on the skeptical, his private writings revealing a mind shaped by the cold calculation of logistics rather than the fleeting enthusiasm of a headline. Brooke understood with a professional's depth that naval power in the vast Pacific depended not only on the physical ships lost in the heat of combat, but on the invisible pillars of industrial replacement, the training of elite aircrews, and the agonizing logistics required to project force across thousands of miles of open ocean. Even if the Japanese carrier force had suffered a heavy blow, Brooke knew that the Japanese Empire remained a formidable and fanatical opponent capable of prolonged resistance. And thus he saw Midway not as a glorious conclusion, but as a single, vital data point in a war that still demanded an almost superhuman level of endurance. In the quiet halls of the Admiralty, First Sea Lord Dudley Pound reviewed the reports with a professional focus that masked the exhaustion of overseeing Britain's naval struggles since the very outbreak of the conflict, his primary concern being how American naval strength might now be applied to the global chessboard. Pound wondered if the United States Navy would now be better positioned to contain the Japanese threat without drawing vital resources away from the Atlantic lifeline that Britain depended upon for its very survival. Realizing that the destruction of Japanese carriers suggested a magnificent opportunity, but also raised haunting questions about future Allied coordination. Across the sprawling city of London, the news remained tightly controlled and hidden from a public that had grown weary of the war's heavy burdens, with no immediate announcements and no newspapers carrying headlines of victory, because the government understood the psychological danger of inflating expectations. British civilians were still enduring the daily grind of rationing, the constant vigilance of air raid precautions, and the heartbreaking absence of family members serving across the globe, and therefore the leadership's language, had to reflect that somber reality. Victory, if it was truly coming, would be acknowledged only when its strategic meaning was fully understood and corroborated by a sequence of signals that left no room for error or doubt. What the British leaders recognized in those first hours was not a moment of triumph, but a tectonic shift in the war's momentum, marking the first time since the devastation of Pearl Harbor that Japan appeared to have suffered a major operational defeat at the hands of American carrier forces. The psychological effect of this realization was significant, even if it remained unspoken in the corridors of power, suggesting to the weary men in London that Japan was not invulnerable and that its offensive reach had definitive limits. Yet the discipline of the high command demanded a total silence until hard facts could replace the flickering hope of the initial reports. And as the day moved on and additional confirmations arrived, the internal language of the command structure remained measured and clinical. Words like possibly decisive were strictly avoided by the analysts, who instead focused their assessments on the serious Japanese losses and the potential strategic consequences for the Indian Ocean and the defense of India. The High Command had learned through blood and fire that wars were not won by isolated, but by the sustained pressure of industrial output and the grim endurance of the fighting man, leading them to view Midway as a beginning rather than an end. By the evening of that momentous day, British leaders understood they were witnessing the opening of a terrifyingly new phase in the Pacific War, one that would unfold slowly and at a cost in human life that was yet to be fully calculated. The restraints shown in London reflected a deep respect for the uncertainty of naval warfare, where a single lucky strike or a change in the weather could reverse the fortunes of empires in a matter of minutes. Britain had seen too many early victories fade into long, agonizing struggles. And the lesson of Midway that was forming in the minds of the men in Whitehall was that even the best news carried with it a heavy weight of responsibility. When the confirmation finally arrived, it did not come as a single dramatic report, but as a sequence of corroborated signals that naval intelligence began to piece together with surgical precision, finally stating with confidence that 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed or rendered inoperable. The scale of this loss was without precedent in the entirety of Japanese naval history, representing the effective destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy's core offensive naval air arm, and a blow from which their industrial base might never recover. British planners understood the significance of this immediately, knowing that carriers were not interchangeable assets but complex systems requiring years of training for air crews and skilled deck officers who could not be replaced in a single season. Unlike Britain or the United States, the Japanese Empire lacked the deep industrial wells and the massive pilot training programs required to absorb such a catastrophic loss of human and material capital, which signaled a structural weakness that the Allies could now exploit. Still, the official memoranda avoided the word decisive, preferring instead to refer to the battle as a serious alteration in the balance of naval power, a phrase that allowed for the continued preparation and the ongoing vigilance required to win a global conflict. Winston Churchill, briefed repeatedly as the intelligence emerged, responded with an admiration for the American achievement that was devoid of any self-indulgence, recognizing that the United States Navy had achieved something Britain itself could not have attempted in 1942. With British carriers too few in number and British commitments stretched across the Mediterranean and the North Sea, the Prime Minister privately acknowledged that Midway represented a moment of supreme competence by American commanders under extreme pressure. However, he never lost sight of the fact that Britain's own war position had not materially improved overnight, with German U-boats still sinking merchant ships at an alarming rate, and British ground forces in North Africa preparing for a desperate confrontation with German armor. General Alan Brooke, observing the situation through the lens of long-term global strategy, noted in his private reflections that Midway, while a spectacular tactical triumph for the United States, did not immediately liberate the British Empire from its most pressing dangers. The Imperial Japanese Army remained largely intact, holding vast swaths of occupied territory across Southeast Asia, while the threat to India and the Indian Ocean remained a jagged thorn in the side of British planning. Brooke's primary concern was that the intoxicating air of political enthusiasm following the victory might outrun the grueling strategic reality of a war that still demanded years of sustained agonizing effort. He believed with a firm professional conviction that premature optimism was a weapon the enemy could use to distort Allied priorities, potentially encouraging the public to expect a rapid victory in a theater that was still defined by vast distances and logistical nightmares. Just like that, the focus returned to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, where Brooke insisted that every gain in the Pacific had to be balanced by an unwavering discipline elsewhere, ensuring that the Allied Germany First strategy was not undermined by the temporary brilliance of a single naval engagement. First Sea Lord Dudley Pound watched the shifting tides of naval warfare with a grim, seasoned eye, recognizing that the destruction of the Japanese carriers confirmed a definitive shift in leadership within the Allied alliance. While the victory strengthened the overall Allied position, it underscored Britain's increasing dependence on American industrial might and naval power to secure the Pacific, effectively relegating the Royal Navy to a secondary, though still essential role in that theater. Pound viewed this not as a loss of national prestige, but as a necessary specialization of roles, allowing Britain to concentrate its remaining naval strength on the critical Atlantic lifelines and the amphibious planning required for the eventual liberation of Europe. Immediately, the Admiralty began to treat Midway as a strategic adjustment, a containment of Japanese expansion that allowed British planners to finally think in terms of time and attrition rather than constant panicked emergency. But time remained the most expensive commodity in the war, and every month that passed without a conclusion meant more merchant ships at the bottom of the ocean and more airmen lost over the skies of occupied Europe. Inside the war cap, the discussions centered heavily on what Midway allowed the Allies to do next, rather than what it promised in terms of an immediate end to the fighting. The leaders had witnessed the rapid collapse of France and the sudden fall of Singapore, lessons that taught them how quickly apparent strength could evaporate under the relentless pressure of modern warfare. Consequently, Midway was treated as an opportunity to be preserved with extreme care, a responsibility that required the British leadership to avoid any form of triumphal language that might suggest the war's difficulty had diminished. Across the Atlantic, American naval aviators had struck a blow that impressed even the most seasoned and cynical British officers. Yet that admiration was always balanced by a somber awareness of the human cost. Thousands had died, ships had burned, and victory had been purchased at a price that demanded sobriety rather than applause, a reality that Churchill understood better than anyone. The Prime Minister's public statements during this period were masterpieces of careful restraint, praising Allied cooperation, and acknowledging American success without ever elevating the battle beyond its strategic context. He deliberately avoided timelines and promises of quick victory, knowing that false optimism could be just as corrosive to national morale as despair. As the weeks turned into months, the confirmation of the victory at Midway settled into the daily routines of British leadership, becoming one of many signals in a global war of intelligence and endurance. Churchill continued to move between cables and briefings with the same relentless urgency he had maintained since 1940, his emotional distance serving as a shield to protect his judgment from being dulled by temporary satisfaction. He had seen sea power squandered through miscalculation during the First World War and had watched the Royal Navy absorb irreplaceable losses in the present conflict, making him acutely sensitive to the fragility of naval dominance. For the men responsible for national survival, Midway changed the calculations on the map, but it did not lighten the heavy burden of responsibility for the soldiers facing German armor in the desert or the sailors dying in the freezing waters of the Atlantic. The victory also prompted a deep dive into the effectiveness of signals intelligence, as British analysts noted the parallels between the American code-breaking success at Midway and Britain's own ultra-intelligence. This reinforced the value of patience, secrecy, and disciplined execution, qualities that the British had been forced to master during the dark years when they stood alone against the Axis powers. Strategically, the battle reframed Japan as a power that could be worn down and contained, allowing the Allied planners to transition from a reactive posture to one of long-term planning. Yet even as they planned for the future, the memory of 1940 remained vivid, reminding leaders like General Brooke that wars are often lost when opportunity is mistaken for certainty. In London, the absence of public celebration was a deliberate political choice, a form of discipline intended to keep the population focused on the sacrifice still required to achieve total victory. British civilians enduring the grind of the home front received the news of the Pacific success within the context of ongoing fighting, knowing that their own loved ones were still in harm's way. Leadership language reflected a profound respect for this reality, choosing to omit any promises of a quick end to the conflict or any claims that British losses in Asia had been fully redeemed. This restraint was rooted in the understanding that victory imposes its own kind of responsibility, the responsibility to ensure that the gains made at such a high cost were protected through sustained effort and careful coordination. Midway entered the British historical memory not as a moment of ecstatic release, but as a crucial correction to the myth of Japanese invincibility. It was a beginning, the opening of a new and grueling phase where the industrial superiority of the United States would begin to dictate the pace of the war. For Churchill, Brooke, and Pound, the lesson was clear. Even the most brilliant victory carried the risk of complacency, and in the year 1942, the world was still too dangerous for anything less than total resolve. The strategic pivot allowed the British to breathe, but only just enough to tighten their grip on the theaters where they were still the primary combatants. The Mediterranean remained a boiling cauldron of conflict, and the survival of the United Kingdom still rested on the success of the convoys crossing the Atlantic under the shadow of the U-boat wolf packs. Midway had effectively removed the nightmare scenario of a Japanese fleet appearing in the Atlantic or launching a full-scale invasion of India, but it did not remove the German presence from the gates of Moscow or the borders of Egypt. As the intelligence assessments solidified, the Admiralty concluded that Japanese naval aviation had suffered a structural blow that time alone could not repair, specifically citing the loss of the veteran pilots who had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor. This depletion of human capital was viewed by British officers as the most significant long-term consequence of the battle, as they knew from their own experience that ships could eventually be built, but elite aircrews took years to forge. The containment of Japan did not shorten the road ahead, rather it defined the direction of the journey, ensuring that the Pacific would become a war of attrition that Japan was fundamentally unequipped to win. Throughout the summer of 1942, the British leadership integrated the data from Midway into a broader, more confident understanding of the global conflict. But they did so with the quiet, somber discipline of men who knew that the hardest fighting was still to come. Every ship lost and every pilot killed at Midway was seen as a demand for a corresponding level of resolve from the survivors. The silence in the London press and the measured tones of the War Cabinet were the ultimate tributes to the seriousness of the struggle. In the end, Midway mattered not because it ended the war, but because it created the responsibility to finish it without illusion or haste. The War Cabinet continued to meet, the maps continued to be updated, and the British people continued to work, all with the silent knowledge that the tide had turned, even if the shore was still miles away. The focus remained on the cumulative nature of victory, built brick by brick through coordination and endurance. As the sun set over the Admiralty in late June, the signals from the Pacific were no longer shocking. They were the new reality. The decisive moment had passed, but the work of winning remained. Despite the tactical finality of the sinking carriers, the British High Command understood that the Japanese spirit of Bushido would translate into a fanatical defense of every island and every outpost remaining in their grasp. Churchill, ever the student of history, recognized that an enemy cornered is often at its most lethal, meaning that the Allies had to prepare for a level of savagery in the Pacific that would test the moral and physical limits of their fighting forces. This realization forced a quiet intensification of training for British and Commonwealth troops in the Far East, emphasizing jungle warfare and survival in conditions that had previously favored the Japanese aggressor. The strategic breathing room provided by Midway also allowed for a more robust reinforcement of Australia and New Zealand, ensuring that these vital Allied partners remain anchored within the broader war effort. Intelligence reports from the Southwest Pacific began to detail the brutal nature of the fighting in places like the Solomon Islands, reinforcing the British view that Midway was merely the end of the beginning. Every tactical move was now scrutinized for its long-term viability, as the era of desperate defense gave way to the agonizingly slow process of reclaiming stolen territory. Behind the scenes in Whitehall, economic planners were already calculating the sheer volume of steel, oil, and rubber required to sustain a multi-theater offensive that spanned the entire globe. They knew that the victory at Midway had secured the supply lines from the United States, but the logistical burden of moving those supplies across the vast Pacific and Atlantic remained a constant, looming threat. The British leadership remained locked in a state of high alert discipline, refusing to allow the glitter of a naval triumph to distract them from the cold, hard mathematics of global total war. As 1942 progressed, The shadow of Midway served as a beacon of what was possible, but the path toward the ultimate surrender of the Axis powers remains shrouded in the smoke of 1,000 smaller, yet equally vital battles. Considering the heavy losses Britain had already suffered in 1942, do you think Churchill was right to keep the news of the Midway victory so quiet? Or should he have used it to boost national morale immediately? Let us know your strategy in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.